Alright, so off we go with Lecture 14, which is all about the Cold War. Now, the Cold War will actually last for the rest of the class. There's really two major themes for the remaining the remaining portion of the class. One is the Cold War, one is the Civil Rights Movement. And if we had an essay question, one would be about the Cold War, but probably won't be doing an essay question on the final. It's probably just be too much to try to tackle that in the situations we're working under right now. Well, let's talk about the Cold War. The Cold War is what we call there's a period after World War II, and it runs until the fall of the Berlin Wall around about 1991 or so, and the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union, where basically the world is there's two great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And at times it gets very, very tense. Okay, the competition is fierce. I think one of the things that'll be challenging to people in the future who didn't live through it will be seeing the Cold War as serious, because this doesn't turn into like World War III, but that's the fear, that it could turn into World War III. And no one really enjoyed World War II, so nobody's looking forward to the sequel. It's a very tense time, but because it doesn't turn hot, they call it a Cold War. So I think a lot of people won't take it seriously. But there weren't any casualties in the Cold War, but there were, and we'll be talking about that over the course of the next 3 or 4 weeks. So, and we'll see how many videos it takes to get through this thing. But let's start by talking about the origins of the Cold War. So, origins of the Cold War comes right out of the situation at the end of World War II. Okay, involves Eastern Europe, and specifically as kind of a focal point is Germany. So remember, at the end of World War II, the Soviet armies were advancing from the east. If you're in Europe, okay, so if you're in Europe, the Soviets are coming in from the east. The British and the Americans are coming in from the west. The Soviets end up, liberating Poland. They go into some other countries, Czechoslovakia, I suppose, Austria, Hungary. Basically, don't ask me for the exact list, but they're moving one direction, and then the British and the British and the Americans are liberating France, Belgium, Holland, okay, Luxembourg, and the two will meet in the middle. Now, and Germany itself will end up being divided. Let me get the map here. I think there's a map coming up. All right. Berlin Wall, you know what? That's actually a 1960s thing. So let's go past that. Get an actual map. Don't have a map. All right. There's a map later. Germany, like I said, is actually split into occupation zones. There's a British zone and an American zone and a Russian zone. And Berlin falls within the Russian occupation zone. But for symbolic reasons, all the major Allied powers are occupying Berlin. So Berlin has an American sector, it has a British sector, I believe there was a French sector, if I recall, and there's a Russian sector. So within the big sphere of Eastern Germany, which is all controlled by the Soviets, like the visual aids here, there's this little island of Berlin where it has all the powers there. Okay? And this is going to cause stress. And Winston Churchill comes up, remember him, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain at this point. Okay? Comes up, he says, an iron curtain is fallen across Europe, from like the Adriatic in the south up to the Baltic in the north. Okay? These two ideological things, words fail me, are not compatible. I mean, you have capitalism and democracy. Okay? Then we have the totalitarian communist regime of the Soviet Union. and so they don't really trust each other. They had held together just long enough to defeat Hitler, and as soon as Hitler's gone, that was the common thread that allowed them to try to work through their differences. Okay? Now, the Soviets want a buffer area between the Western democracies and themselves. Russia has been invaded by Germany twice in 25 years, so they'd really like to have, you know, a series of buffer states standing between them and the Western powers. Okay? And so Winston Churchill, seen here in the middle, uh, he's no longer prime minister, but like I said, he came up where he used the term Iron Curtain in this speech. Now you notice he's speaking from behind the seal of the President of the United States. He made this speech in Fulton, Missouri. And doggone, that sure looks like Harry Truman to me right there. So I'm guessing Harry Truman, who's wearing a mortarboard, I'm guessing he was speaking at this college and that he invited Churchill along to talk. Okay? So the Iron Curtain, we're not talking about the kind of open borders you see today with the European Union. You can just get in your car and drive over, across the border. Okay? The borders are, there's barbed wire and minefields and guard towers. People waiting to see your papers. You just, if you live in the Western occupation zone of Germany, and you have family members in the Eastern zone occupied by the Soviets, you just don't get in your car and say, "Hey, let's drive over to see Grandma this weekend." It's been cut off from you. It's very hard to get across. Okay? And this will stay this way for various degrees of severity for a few decades. Okay. So anyway, that's known as the Iron Curtain. Two hostile camps, that have divided Europe, between them. Now, what are the reasons for this? Now, I've already touched on it some. Let me, I'll see if I can readdress it here. So, reasons for the Cold War. Yeah. The biggest ones, two different political, ways of looking at things. Communism, like I said, democracy. The Soviets, like I said, are a little paranoid. Okay, they've been invaded by the Germans, like I said, twice in 25 years. They're worried could this happen again. We're also concerned, from the American standpoint, about the way the Soviets are doing things. They've gone into Eastern Europe and they've liberated these countries and set up basically puppet governments. Okay, run by communists. If they have elections, you might get to choose, between communist A and communist B if you're lucky. That's just how they roll. Okay, we're not particularly trusting in Joseph Stalin. Now, the Soviets have something to worry. The United States has the atomic bomb. They don't. Okay, and so that could make them a little jumpy too. So there's a lot of suspicion and animosity that will drive this Cold War. And these two great superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union, a lot of the smaller third world countries kind of get caught in the middle. And, the United States is trying to convince them that, being on our side is the best. And the Soviets, of course, would like to get people in their sphere of influence. Okay, let's move forward. A lot of this will probably be explained in the book too. All right. Now, this is an important concept. I want you to know this one. All right. So how do you deal with the Soviet Union? You have a country that's run more or less by a totalitarian dictator, Joseph Stalin, okay, who's murdered untold numbers of his own people. There's not a lot of personal liberties in the Soviet Union. Very suspicious of them. What do you do? How do you deal with this? Well, I guess one thing you could do is just go to war with them. We already had an army in Europe. We could have just invaded the Soviet Union, I guess, and gone after them. It hadn't worked out too well for Hitler, though. And honestly, nobody's anxious to do anything like that. I mean, we just got out of this nasty war. So there's people trying to figure out, well, what do you do about the Soviet Union? So a person who's considered a key player in this is a guy named George Kennan. Okay, there's a picture of him here. George Kennan was one of these people who worked for the State Department, and his job was to try to understand the Soviet Union, figure out what they're doing, what makes them tick, where are they coming from exactly, and so he's an expert in the Soviet Union. Okay? Winston Churchill had once said, prior to World War II, I looked it up to make sure I get the quote right. He says the Soviet Union was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. It's like those little Russian nesting dolls. You open one up and there's another one inside. You open it up and there's another one inside. No one really understands why the Soviets do what they do because they don't usually forthcoming about why they do things. But George Kennan is one of the people who sits around trying to figure this thing out. And so he will write a document. I've heard it referred to as the long letter, and I've also heard it referred to as the long telegram. Okay, but he sits down and writes out, his thoughts on the Soviet Union and how to keep them. Because remember, the number one thing on the Soviet Union to-do list is spread the communist revolution throughout the world. I mean, workers of world unite. It's like on their list of things to do. Spread the joy of communism to other countries. Okay, and Kennan's trying to figure out, well, what do you do about this? And here's basically what he comes up with. Now, I've never read this thing, but here it is at a summary. Is the Soviet Union is inherently an unstable system. Okay? It's based on a faulty premise that everybody can cooperate and work together and share the benefits of their product equally. Okay? This sounds really good on paper, but it goes against the way human beings actually function. Okay? It's only working in the Soviet Union, he can argue, is because it's being imposed upon the people by this totalitarian regime. And so Kennan says the only way for the Soviet Union to continue to survive is to continue to expand and spread and bring new people under its control. So he argues the thing to do is not to try to defeat them militarily, because that would be, cost a lot of money and a lot of lives. He said the thing to do is you keep it from spreading. You contain the Soviet Union. You wall it off, not literally wall it, but keep it. It's like a cancer. You keep it from spreading out into the rest of the body. Okay? And if you can contain it, then it will eventually collapse of its own inherent instability. Does this sound like anything in the 1301 half of the class? If I had the class in front of me, sometimes somebody gets it. It's kind of a Republican plan for dealing with slavery in the years prior to the Civil War. We don't know how to get rid of it right now, they say, but let's not let it spread, and eventually it'll end up falling apart of its own, moral corruptness. Okay? That's kind of what George Kennan comes up with in this long letter/telegram. There's actually like a formal document. It's like NSC 48 or something. We won't talk about that. It might show up in the book, though. Okay. This policy of containment will drive how the United States acts in the Cold War pretty much for most of the Cold War. What the United States will do is try to check the growth of the Soviet Union through various means. Diplomatic means, military means, economic means. In fact, the essay question that goes with the Cold War is something to that effect: how to view as use economic, military, and economic, military, and diplomatic means to thwart the Soviet Union. Okay? And containment is a big part of it. Let's not let it spread. Okay? Coming up on the time limit here for the video, so we'll stop with Kennan. We'll come back in part 2 with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan.